Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. And today, we're all about names, about naming. Well, actually, we're really more about the guy behind the names. My friend, collaborator, occasional client, sometime vendor, but all around good sport. The founder and managing director of Tange branding, Scott Milano. Now, I hope you're ready to go deep into the world of naming because, one of the things I was really excited about having Scott on this show is some of the names that he's been behind are legends and certainly names that you will have heard of. So I wanted to, get an inside look into the creative discipline that it takes to be a successful namer and also what it takes to build one of the most successful naming agencies around today. So without further ado, welcome Scott Milano from Tange Branding. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing great. And you know what? Thank you so much for being on the show. I got to say that you are you're one of the guests or one of the people that I wanted to have on the show even before the show became a show in my head, right? When I think of my universe of people who I respect, admire, and just like to have a beer with and just kind of want to talk with, you're like right towards the top of my list. And I'd like to give our listeners a clue as to why that's the case. And it goes back, almost 20 years now, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Almost 20 years to some very optimistic early days in Tokyo, where we both lived at the time. And Scott had come over from the States to Tokyo. I mean, I didn't know who he was. We didn't know each other. I had been there probably for about, 7 or 8 years by that point. And I had left a job with a major company, with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'd left my job, the corporate world behind, because I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and I thought that I could make a fortune on my own. And the only skill that I really thought I had was writing, or the only unique skill probably in Tokyo was that I was a writer. But I'd never actually gone out ahead and decided that I was actually a writer. So I got some business cards printed, and I said, hey, I formed an LLC, got some business card printed that said I was a copywriter. Then I didn't know where to go, so I just kind of looked around the internet at the time and I said, who are some local copywriters that I can kind of connect with? So this is pre-LinkedIn, or just about the time LinkedIn was starting. And I found this website called Rubber Writer, right? Right? And but it was cool because just typical kind of Google search, copywriters in Tokyo. And I came across this guy, Scott Milano. So I figured, why not? I reached out, sent him an email, and Scott responded right away. And we set up a time to meet. It turned out he didn't live that far from me. And one of his clients was pretty close to where I was living at the time. So we set up a time to meet. And we met, and it just turns out that right at that moment, Scott was in the process of wrapping up his own kind of freelance copywriting adventures and moving into a big time branding agency role, which then kind of shaped his career thereafter. But and I'll let him talk about that when it comes time. But the point is that the timing of that one email that I sent out could not have been better for me, and maybe for Scott too. But it certainly could not have been better for me because almost immediately, with zero effort on my part, except for a well-timed email and a good lunch, I suppose, suddenly I'm like, I have these clients that Scott decided that I guess he liked me and said, hey, why don't you meet with these people and see if you can start writing for them because I need to find a replacement for my work. So it was the exact jump start that I needed to start my business, which was called In Writing. And, I got a couple of clients that way, a couple of contacts who are among my best and closest friends, mentors, colleagues to this day, and some of whom might appear on this podcast in the future. And essentially, because of this whole idea of human connections, where you find people that you align with, that you kind of are simpatico with, you make a connection, and then suddenly the world changes. anything can happen when you connect with somebody new. Scott is a perfect example of this. And I say that as a very long kind of preamble to say how much I really respect and admire Scott, but also that I would not be probably where I am today if it were it not for Scott Milano. So, you know, you're not going to hear that same story with any guest I'm going to have on this podcast for sure. And I owe so much to Scott. So I want to make this time we have together a really good time for Scott to really talk about what's on his mind, and to showcase some of the reasons why I think that Scott is, you know, not only one of the, kind of leading professionals in his field, but also a hell of a great guy to know. So on that note, man, how are you?
I'm great, Dan. That's a nice walk back, into our history. What was that name of that bar that we met at? It was like a soccer pub, Beatnik or something.
The Beatnik, yeah. Footnik.
Footnik, that's it.
Footnik in Ebisu. So any Japan listeners out there, Footnik is still around, I'm sure. It's where business happens, and beer. Yeah, that's right. We met at the Footnik. Unbelievable. And we had a great. I think those are great days, and it is a kind of journey back in time, which makes me think, lots happened since then. So how about we just start off? If you can give us a little bit of a roll up into how'd you get from there to here, and here being the managing director of Tange.
Yeah, it's the founder and managing director of Tanj. If you go to Tanj, TANJ.co, you can get a feel for what we do. But on that front, we're a brand naming and language studio, very short and simple in terms of what we offer. But how do you get there, right? Or how does one get there? One being me. I think a lot of it, kind of ties into this idea of just kind of doing what you like. Like I've been fortunate enough to be in a position to do the things that I like, and I think that's probably the only way that I'm going to be successful at something. Is just actually, finding what it is that interests me and really making something out of it. And I always go back and I think about like when I was in college, I had no idea what I wanted to do at all. I just knew, it was going to be a good experience, and I wanted to find something and tried, different subjects and liked some of them. But ultimately, as soon as I found philosophy, I just was like, wow. This is awesome. I'm going to totally get into it. And, again, I say fortunate enough. Luckily, my parents weren't like beating me over the head and saying like, get an accounting degree. What are you going to do? But no, they were super supportive. And I just got really deep into it and really enjoyed it. From there, philosophy is all about thinking. It's about putting pen to paper, building arguments, just, creating, essentially creating an argument. So I love that, but wasn't super excited about like trying to get a PhD in philosophy or something like that. So what I found that I really liked that I thought was relevant, to a professional career was the writing aspect. I was a terrible writer in the beginning. Even my professor, he was like, here's a copy of Strunk and White. Get to it. Like, just figure out how to write because it's not good. Where it stands now. So I took that to heart. Tried to really work on it, and ultimately, when I got out of college, I wanted to write. So I just got a job writing. I was working for a B2B trade magazine and as an editor, and learning how to interview people, learning how to craft short articles and. Again, like just trying to level up my game, got a lot of help from my editors and in being able to write better and better. At the same time, I, was just out of college and wanted some adventure and had been looking around at different markets, mainly in Asia, to figure out, hey, can I take this writing thing on the road and like make a career out of it internationally? And I, looked at a bunch of different areas, but Japan in particular seemed like the best place to just kind of get to it, have a decent career, decent life, and certainly it's a fascinating place. So without really too much preparation. I took a short Japanese language class, got a ticket, went over and ultimately built Rubber Writer initially, which was my kind of freelance brand, Rubber Writer. So funny to remember that name. It was all about flexibility. I'm super flexible. I can write.
You had the naming down even back then, man. I didn't know.
Yeah. So, from there, just kind of getting into copywriting and learning that side of it and that craft.
But you didn't speak any Japanese. You just decided, I'm interested in Japan. I think it's a good market, so I'm going there.
Yeah. I literally knew probably like 5 to 10 words prior to going, and then once I got there, I realized like, hey, if I'm going to make something of this, I have to learn Japanese. So, studied for quite a while, studied on the job, working with people, have friends, Japanese friends, you kind of can get immersed in it and got pretty good at it. Not quite as good as you, but
No.
Was decent enough to do some business and presentations, things like that. But that's when I also, after kind of the Rubber Writer thing, and when we met, and I kind of transitioned into this weird world of naming, and I didn't know much about it in the beginning, but I thought, wow, isn't that a cool field to be working in? It's all rooted in language, but you're just sending out these zany little names, into the world, and they hopefully last forever. So it was just this fascinating world that I had stumbled upon and got into very quickly. And really, this was, I think I kind of found my craft, the thing that I loved most. From there, I've been naming stuff for more than 15 years.
If you're going to pick a niche, right? I think you picked a really good one. And certainly there are very few people who, I think, given the experiences that we've both had, but certainly experiences that I've had, both working with you, for you, with you, and at even one point or another, working with Tange as your customer. I've seen all aspects of the naming game, at least from that perspective. And I got to tell you, the actual work of it all, when on the occasional project that we worked on together when you were with Interbrand back in the day, and even after when you were with Tange, on occasion, with full disclosure, everybody, on the occasion when I was freelance or when I had time to do consulting, I hit up Scott pretty much every time, because we'd worked together before, and I really loved the creative exercise. I have to tell you, I love the creative exercise of trying to come up with 400, 500, whatever the number of 100 names for a widget, a service, a product, something. Mm-hmm. And that was just on the, I only did it a few times. I only can begin to imagine what it is to make a career of that, what it is to really almost wholly focus and specialize in this art form and this linguistic form. And I want to hear a lot more about that, actually, and I'm sure that our listeners do too, because I don't think people understand what it's about. I know that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that most people don't understand what goes into a name. So I wanted to, from the expert here, what is about naming? What is it? The good, the bad, and the ugly? What is it that people don't get? How would you talk about it if you were? Well, please talk about it.
Yeah. So I think the good is, or just what is it, right? Like you're creating a piece of language that identifies something in the world, whether it's a product, service, company, organization, initiative, experience. It could be anything. But if you don't have that name, you don't really have that thing. Like people can't even talk about it. So it's not even a brand.
Yeah.
And then names themselves, they're really meaningful. They're really powerful, especially if you get it right. And all of the kind of DNA of the brand, I always say the name is the tip of the spear for any brand. And all the DNA is like wrapped up in it, which I think is fascinating. Everything is kind of encoded in there. Even if it's not in there, it's still in there. So I think, that's that's pretty interesting and powerful, at least from my perspective. The bad, you said it's the good, bad, the ugly, I guess. It's hard.
It's really hard.
Most people don't realize how hard it is. They think,
it's really
I'll just step up to a whiteboard, jot down a few ideas and call it a day. But it's really, really hard. It doesn't always have to be that hard. But if you want to do it right and you're working at a certain level as a business and a brand, it becomes a very challenging exercise. And I think it's challenging because it's the intersection of all these different fields. You've got research. You have to understand what's out there already. You've got strategy informed by your research. You have to have some sort of framework on which to create ideas, let alone evaluate ideas. And then you have the actual ideation part or creative element. You know this very well. You have to look at it from all sides and really dig deep and just churn through a lot of volume, because there are other factors that come into play, like your legal issues, so trademark issues. There are linguistic issues. How does a name travel around the world? And then ultimately is like, what kind of story are you going to tell around that name? It's just this intersection of all these, super interesting and incredibly challenging fields kind of coming together. The other thing that I think is makes it a challenge is essentially like you have to get people to buy in. It's not just you making the decision. If it is, it's usually pretty, it's easier, let's say. But it's like, think about naming your children, and you and your wife have to agree on the name. There has to be some sort of agreement on this is the final piece of the puzzle. But within business, you're talking about multiple stakeholders, all types of political dynamics and everything. So that portion of it, I think, is tremendously challenging for a lot of organizations.
That's an interesting point in particular that I know that we've both talked about in the past, but being on the inside of a company for many years now, and several companies for that matter, and having done with, especially in the B2B space where I am doing naming, is really not well understood within an organization. Why this is an important thing to actually pay somebody outside to do this. When I always run into the problem, sometimes we call it the focus group of one problem, right? Where somebody has a brilliant idea that they're going to call the name X, and they think, I love X. I saw, I woke up this morning, I took a shower, looked in the mirror, X, and I knew it. I knew that was the name, Love X. But this is before you go through any kind of process to really even vet. I mean, let's never mind all the legitimate hurdles and obstacles that you have to go through, which you alluded to on the legal side and on the compliance side for names. But just thinking about the meanings that you really want to draw in the name, if it is the tip of the spear of a brand, as you say, to be so cavalier and lackadaisical to say, oh, it's X, does your company, your brand, everybody quite a disservice, even if at the end of the process you end up with X by some miracle, right? I mean, wouldn't you say, if you're going to spend potentially upwards of millions and millions of dollars, and even if it's not that much, if you're going to put your hard-earned time and money into a product or into a service, don't you want to be bought in or have an understanding that you're making the best choice of the options that you have available to you? It always was a kind of no-brainer to me that you do want to have those layers of understanding behind a name. But like, as you said, you have to get buy-in from various people, and some people get the value of it immediately, and some people don't understand that there's a process that you probably should go through. To me, man, it's really hard, like you said, to come up with a name. It's even harder to come up with a good name. And I got it, in my experience, at least half the time, the final decision on a name is some sort of compromise, middling result. And from the creative side, it's frustrating. But I mean, you must have seen this. You must see it all the time, again and again and again. And how do you deal with this when you're talking with your clients?
we see clients make decisions in all types of ways. So you'll have kind of your highly motivated decision makers We once had a client decide on a final name and lock everything up. He happened to be an attorney too. Okay. Within, I think, 35 minutes, which
Good
was
job.
awesome. That was crazy.
Was it 35 minutes from like initial meeting pitch to the end, or was it from?
Once they saw like a set of final options for them to decide.
Well, I don't want anybody to think that it's only like that you can come up with a name in 35 minutes. There was probably weeks or days or hours of time behind that, right? Okay.
But
I don't want to sell yourself short.
It's like the decision, like what, how quickly are you going to make it? So we've seen that 35 minutes, which is incredibly fast. We see a couple days. We see a couple weeks, we see months. I think I've actually seen years. We had a client recently who came back to us 5 years later. We've worked with them regularly since then, but they were like, hey, we finally figured out what we want to do with that company. Can we still use the names that one of the names that you pitched 5 years ago? And it was, of course, yeah. Right. It happens in all sorts of ways.
I mean, and I imagine that when it hits right, it's you don't always know that it hits right away.
Yeah, I would say more often than not, you're not going to know. It's probably like there might be 10% of cases where people are like, that's it. It's just sort of this weird thing about naming. Where they have to grow on you over time, and it's a big emotional decision. Most people can relate to it in terms of naming their kids. Hopefully, it's something that they've thought about, and whether they're creative names or just basic names, it doesn't matter because you're going to commit. You're going to put all your money on this one word for that person or that brand. And even me, when I think about naming my companies or naming my kids or whatever, I know what it is, and you just have to have a certain level of confidence, and then I think you just go. Like that's kind of how when we talk to clients about it, and how I see people make decisions. That's usually like if you can get a certain level, a high level of confidence that it's going to work. They might not be 100% sold on it, but like you get them to that point, and then it always works.
And I know that that's grown over time with you. I mean, you started off just starting with verbal identity and moved into overseeing a bigger group, and then starting your own agency where you're focused on this and you're delivering to some major clients. And anybody who wants to know who they are can just go to Tange.co and find out. But I'm going to share a little anecdote. I don't know if you remember this even, Scott, but to talk about the agony of naming a little bit, and that whole point of, did I make the right call on this, right? Mm-hmm. And that beginning part of, oh my God, is this the right name or not? I mean, I'm sure that at this time that I'm going to talk about, you were fairly confident that you made the right choice. But there was a major product in Japan, and this is back when I had in writing, and I was doing some freelancing for you. And you were at Interbrand, and I visited you at your office because we were working on a project. And I was going into a briefing. We were going to talk about whatever this particular naming project was. But I remember getting in there, and you were you had your head in your hands on your desk, and I could see like you were kind of sweating and you were nervous. And I'm like, why are you nervous? And you showed me the media reports on this new product that had just come out called the Nintendo Wii, right? A revolutionary game that everybody who is listening to this is obviously familiar with, right? But at the time when this was happening in the early 2000s, the Wii was just created, and there were a lot of, let's just say, chatter. There was a lot of chatter about that name.
Yeah, a lot of blowback.
A lot of blowback. And as the guy on the team, who was responsible for that, I think that I remember just seeing you kind of sweating it a little bit. But, there was the obvious allusion to a wee sounding like wee wee and pee pee and so on, right? There was where the heck did this come from, just out of nowhere. And you had a really good story behind it, why you chose that word or why that was one of the main candidates for a name.
Well, I didn't choose it. I happened to create it, and I thought it was great. We knew about as just sort of negative associations with it, but I think for so many different reasons, it and we knew that that would just fall by the wayside once the brand was launched and the product was experienced and developed and grown. But the really short story is like this whole thing, the console and the controller were meant to totally turn gaming upside down. If you lead with a name that sounds like Xbox, PlayStation, sort of, Game Boy is a little more creative, but like at the time, I think, the team and the client too, they felt like it's just going to signal the same old, and it's not going to do anything to propel them back to number one from a distant third. And, we had created a variety of other, really out there names. But that one worked really well because it's incredibly short. The story behind it is very simple. It was all about taking gaming out of, purely the world of like hardcore gamers and letting everybody play together. So that it comes from the English pronoun of we, as in we play together. And it's just spun lightly to give it a funky Japanese feel. And, it's just sort of a level of abstraction that makes it work.
It works visually too because the eyes look like the controllers.
Yeah. We baked all that into the name somehow. Like literally when pitching it, it was like, we know this is geeky, but like, look, there's the controllers in the eyes, in the two eyes. And they were like,
I can see it.
So yeah, but it's a fun one. It's a good legacy name. The console itself, the product itself, really pushed the market in a very different direction. Mm-hmm. And I think the name did have something to do with that. It's just an out of left field idea.
Absolutely. I mean, just the fact that it was the topic of such conversation outside of the gaming industry, was itself, I think, a huge boon in the end to the name and to the fame of the platform, and to Nintendo's wisdom in choosing that. Mm-hmm. But at the time, the point is that at the time when I walked into the office that day, you were just like definitely stressed out about it, and it's just this whole idea that the name initially is going to get blowback, and you got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, they almost all, not always. I mean, there are a lot of cases where names launch and it's just fine. But for something that's so high profile in that particular type of sector, where even whenever it was 2006, 2007, there's just a ton of internet chatter anyway. Mm-hmm. And everybody has an opinion when it comes to names. So naturally, that's going to come out.
Sometimes that is the bane of our existence when we're running a marketing team internally, or we're trying to come up with, we're tasked internally within the organization. We need to have a name for whatever this new thing is. It's really hard when it's a internal kind of organization or something that's never going to see the light of day. We just need a name, and going through a process isn't always a rewarded or well recognized necessity. Mm-hmm. By the leadership of our companies. That's why it's always refreshing to have somebody like Scott come in and explain, this is the process, this is why we do this. And I hope that anybody listening who is running a marketing team or who certainly is involved in, making some decisions about naming at some point understands that, when you just decide to take 5 minutes and run a bunch of words through a thesaurus and say, okay, I like this one. Let's change the last letter from a C to an X. You're running some serious risks there, man. I mean, it's never that simple, or it shouldn't be. There's got to be a lot of thought because, as Scott just said, naming is the tip of the spear when it comes to branding, right? When it comes to brand, it's a fundamental building block. The right name will actually identify or kind of reinforce the value that the brand values, and a great name will do that to the public, to the consumer, in such a way that it will enhance the actual value of the brand. I mean,
definitely. I mean, it's about telling. We always approach it in terms of like just telling the story of the brand in one word, or maybe it's a phrase or two words put together, but it's just the fundamental story of what this is, or what it's all about.
To boil that down into one solid name, a small word or a phrase, the difficulty, I can only describe times when I was working with Scott on a project and I had an Excel sheet in front of me, right, with various themes that I wanted to I had a very specific assignment, name something, come up with a certain number of names along these themes. You can use this kind of language. There are certain guidelines sometimes, but you need 50, 100 names under each of these categories. And believe me, 10 names, no problem. 20 names gets a little bit iffy. 100 names? Oh my goodness. It is, it's harder than writing, an 800-word brand message. It's harder than writing long copy sometimes. It's the kind of thing where you have to keep coming back, or at least I did anyway. I'm sure that there are people who just get it and do it right away. But I mean, for me, I had to keep going back to the well and replenishing my creative juices and then coming back and saying, okay, now I can think in a different way. Yeah. And great exercise. A lot of rewarding times doing that.
That's what I love about it, though, is that, the impact is tremendous, right? Like you create this final piece of language, this one word or a name that, it's a business asset for the client, right? Like it's a piece of intellectual property. Hopefully it's a fresh new idea that you're contributing to the world. There's a temporal aspect to names. Ideally live for as long as the brand lives. Names get changed. That's a large part of our business. When somebody doesn't get it right in the beginning, we can come in and change it. But ideally it should last forever, right? And then, it's just powerful. Hopefully you're creating something that people love, or it's like, it's in their heads, it's in their mouths, it's out there in the world. But it's a word. I don't know. I find it fascinating.
Well, we talked about the we, but are there any examples that you can share that it's a word that just encapsulates everything and stays with the brand for a long time and you feel rewarded by it? Any that you could point to?
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much everything in our portfolio, we are proud of it. Like it's all cool stuff, and it all serves a purpose for the client. I always go back to just a couple kind of my own personal favorites, in addition to we, which is just its own story. Another name that's in our portfolio and was Ally Bank, or Ally Financial. Taking, at a time of turmoil for the banking industry, like these guys went from GMAC to something new for a number of different reasons. Some of them a little bit unsavory, but that's an opportunity within banking which is such a traditional sort of, with regard to names, has tried and true conventions of just sturdy sounding, pretty dry, straightforward stuff. And you can't totally circumvent that in something like financial services. But Ally was a super kind of quick, clean way to telegraph all of that, an ally for your financial well-being and on your side. But then do it in a fresh new way, at least in the context of that sector. And then there's another one that is definitely not as high profile, but it's near and dear to my heart. It's through kind of a partner agency. They work with it's like a digital agency. They work with kind of innovation and design sprints and things like that. And it's called New Haircut. Newhaircut.com. Good team over there. But they came to us with a previous name. It was just, part of the alphabet soup that's out there within agencies. And they wanted something that really stood out and was totally fresh and new. And we just developed, a lot of different ways to express that. But the name New Haircut kind of does it in a very unique, just in an incredibly unique way. It's like the feeling that you have when you get a fresh new haircut that looks great. That's how they help clients, succeed. So it's just that one. That's another favorite in the portfolio.
I love those examples, and I like them. That if you take the we, you take Ally, you take New Haircut, and some of the other things that you've worked on, you'll see on Tange.co. The versatility of your portfolio speaks to, I think, a lot of the creative challenges that a branding agency and certainly a naming expert has to face. So how do you refresh yourself every day? How do you like when you have a new creative brief in front of you? How do you start anew?
Well, we go in basically with it being a blank canvas. We never make any assumptions that it's going to be this or it's going to be that. We just we just listen. We do a lot of listening early on and really try to understand the unique needs of the client for the brand that they're creating. In terms of like just creatively, like we have different frameworks that we use that pretty much sum up all the different territories that we could go. And, we use those to push us into whatever directions that we think are going to be fruitful. But yeah, just the goal is always like just fresh new ideas. And I think that having a broad portfolio of different styles and approaches, just personally as the main like leading the business, that's what I want to bring to market. I don't want us to be coming up with just one particular style and calling it a day and just working on that type of stuff. It's a little dry and boring. We like the creative challenge.
Of course. And you have been a creative professional in the naming space for, nearly 20 years. And how do you personally keep it fresh? Like, is there anything that you do, like personally, to recharge your creative batteries?
Well, you think, you research, and you just churn stuff out. That's how I do it.
Yeah.
One of the techniques that it's a more tangible technique, but it's like I try to do sprints in the morning. Like I don't do any naming work after like 10 a.m. or anything like that. It's like go in early, go in fresh, go in hard, try and knock it out of the park many, many times, and then get out.
Smart, yeah.
So that's my approach.
Back to the issues at hand here, right? So we were talking about the naming process and about how sometimes you just don't know it when you got it. But you talked about some examples. We talked about Ally. We talked about New Haircut, and I love the variety thereof. In a lot of professions out there, especially when it comes to like people selling their own personal brand, like just think of a job search, for example. You can have the best marketer in the world who doesn't know how to sell themselves to an employer. Because when you turn the lens on yourself, it's very hard to kind of have that dispassionate or that kind of methodical way of looking at things. And you have had that. You've had to turn the lens on yourself when you named your own company, Tanj, right? And Tanj itself is a fascinating name. So, can you go a little bit into why you chose Tanj and what that's all about?
Sure. So I would disagree that I had to turn it. I intentionally didn't turn it to myself.
Interesting.
So it's not like Milano and Associates or, Milano and Co. or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want it to be like the Scott Milano show. And in terms of the name itself, Tange, it's actually something that I had rolling around in my head well before I knew exactly what I was going to do in starting the business. But I don't even know why I had it in my head, but it just was there. I remember talking to some fellow namers about this particular name in the context of something else. But it always stuck with me. And then the real tie to the business is first, it's an incredibly unique name. Like nobody knows what it means, and that's intentional. It's short, it's pithy, it's striking visually. I find that interesting, especially in the sea of other naming and branding agencies, which often can be quite boring, surprisingly or unsurprisingly. But the real tie to how I think about the brand and the business is threefold. First, we're working with language. It's inherently abstract. Like, what is a word? What is a sentence? What is a name? You can't really grab onto it, and like you can other, brand related elements of like visual identity and packaging and things like that. It's inherently intangible. So we're trying our best to make it as tangible as possible. A business asset, encoding all the DNA of the brand right up in the name. It's something that goes out into the real world and does work. The second is, this is kind of a geeky Japanese tie. The phrase tanjuni, what you just sort of like, you want to boil something down and put it simply. So for us, and I think how I work and how my team works, we think that the simplest solutions are usually the best and kind of a hallmark of a good idea if it's simple. And then the last one is just tangerines. I knew that I wanted the brand color to be orange, and I like tangerines.
As I can see by the wall behind you, for the listeners who are not going to see this on video, there's just go to tange.co and you'll know the tangerine colors that Scott has woven into the brand. Yeah, I've always loved Tange, and now you're on year 10?
12.
Year 12. Year 12. They say that businesses, most like individual businesses, don't last more than a year or two, but you've been quite successful in building your agency, and it goes back to something you said, I think, at the outset of this of our chat here, which was that you just love what you do, and bringing that passion to your work every day, your purpose, I suppose. I just think it never even occurred to you or anybody who works with you that this wasn't going to succeed, or did it? I don't know. What was like building a business?
I never think about it as like building a business or building an agency. I mean, we're still pretty boutique-y and lean enough to, it just doesn't feel like, I don't think about it in the way that probably other agency owners do or try to do or have done. But it's been a great experience. It's why I wake up in the morning, other than my kids and my wife and my family. This is my life. It's a huge part of my life, and I love the work. I don't know, how have I done that? I'm not quite sure. It's been a very slow, kind of gradual progression, and there's still a lot more work to do. I'm in the midst right now of trying to figure out what the next 12 years could look like. But it's never going to be, just given the nature of the type of business, it's never going to be a huge sprawling agency because we know what we're good at, and that's all that we're pretty much going to do. Mm-hmm. We might bolt on other elements or other services, which we've been doing recently to grow a bit. But I don't see it ever going outside of our core focus of language and brand.
And that probably is the formula. I mean, a relentless focus on the things that you are good at and that you enjoy doing, plus time, it seems. I mean, I'm sure, of course, folks out there who are very more business-minded, certainly more entrepreneurial, might say, no, there's, you have to have the structures right, and you have to make sure that all the finances are blah, blah, blah. Sure, of course. But I think that if you don't have those things, if you don't have that focus on something that you love doing, and time, right? Those two things are so critical to the success of so many of us, I think, or so many businesses out there. Looking at the business that you've built, looking at the agency, the success that you've had over 12 years, and as you said, looking towards the next 12 years, what is it that people should be aware of, right? In your business these days, what is it that you see as a trend in your industry, or that you see as something that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple different things that are important. Anyone who's with regard to naming, anyone who has tried it in the last couple of years knows that it's infinitely more difficult than it was the previous few years, and then before that, and before that, and before that. There's so much naming out there, with just the massive sprawling internet. It's, I mean, any name that you create and you just plug it into Google, you're going to find something that comes up for it, most likely, unless it's just a mishmash of punching the keys, and you might not there, but it's just an inherently higher bar and more difficult tasks than ever before. And we know this every year. It keeps getting more and more difficult for us as well. We constantly innovate and try new approaches. So I feel confident we'll always be ahead of the curve. But it's just an incredibly challenging environment to name in overall, regardless of your sector. And then the other thing that comes to mind is, like, especially for bigger businesses that want that level of certainty and confidence. Market research has been around for a long time, but doing it in the world of naming, maybe a little less so. So what we've been doing actually over the last 2 years is building out kind of this data and research side of our business. Which I find interesting, and it's like testing. How does a name or a message test with real people in the real world, and what is the impact of that on the names themselves, and then the message itself, as well as how you make a decision about it. And we've been doing some interesting stuff with regard to, like, data and analytics to help inform the strategy, things like text mining and, pulling together analytics on language, like what's happening out there in the world with regard to a particular area. All that can kind of influence your strategy. And then I'd say, one of the other areas that we've seen a lot of recently is kind of clients not sure if they have the right name. Should they keep their name or should they change it? And sure, you could have a CEO who's like, forget about it. Let's just go with a new name. I don't like the other name. That's a very easy way to make a decision. But if you have shareholders, if you have a large team, if internally there are different factions, you might have like a serious name and brand problem, and being able to figure that out. Answer the question of should you change your name or not is something that we've seen a fair amount of recently, and clients get a lot of value out of that type of engagement. It solves one simple question, but it's a big question. And then
do you think that's because of just more trepidation in the marketplace these days to change, or is it because of the more open type company environments where decision making is spread more, or something different?
I think it's something different. I think it's like people know that the client will know that there is possibly a problem.
Okay.
Some sort of fundamental business and brand problem. Like the name the name prevents them from going into a new sector, or the name just isn't strong enough to help them grow if they're ramping up for growth, or the name means something different to the market, and they kind of know it, but they need to validate it through some quantitative research. And we've been able to come in and successfully answer those questions for clients. And it's exciting. It's for me. I'm not like a numbers guy, but we have people that do that, and it adds a lot of value for the client, because they're stuck. Like they can't make that one decision because they don't know. They don't have insight into actually what's happening, and we can get in there and figure that out. And again, on the data and research side, we're also seeing like clients, wanting a certain level of confidence in the decisions that they're making. So we can come in and structure just based on, their needs, their budget, timing, various types of programs to validate the decision or validate a set of names to help give them that confidence that they are making the right decision. So, I think naming is getting more and more difficult. And then, on the flip side, like there are all these cool tools and research that you can tie into it to make it slightly less difficult, at least on the client side, which I find interesting.
And that's a trend we see across all of marketing and communications, that the increasing preponderance of data that's available out there, and the, thanks to so many enterprising companies out there who are creating some great tools that allow us to perform analyses and crunch. I'm like you, I was never a numbers guy, but I do love to see how data shakes out sometimes to show trends, to show, insights that nobody would have ever gotten in a million years before. Some novel things that you would never see. I know, I love it. I'm glad, and it doesn't surprise me that that's something that is really taking a bigger part of the most creative parts of our businesses. Certainly naming is one of those.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how it influences where you can go creatively too. Like, you have some proof that that's not a good concept to pursue.
It must make clients feel good.
Yeah, because it's bringing, some objectivity and certainty into what is inherently an incredibly subjective exercise, which is cool. I love that.
Awesome, man. So before we go, do you have any last words? Can you, where can people find you if they want to know more about Tange and they want to know more about Scott Milano?
Yeah, sure. So just go to tanj.co, Tanj.co. And you can find out a little bit more about the business, myself, my team, what we do, what we've done, and that's pretty much it.
Awesome, man. Well, listen, we do have to cover off on our Japan side of our lives, I think, in a separate, discussion. As I gather those Japan people together, and I'm so glad that you're one of those people. I'm so glad you've been part of my life and my career, and now you're part of my podcast. My gratitude to Scott Milano continues, and in the great bank of karma, I suppose my debt to you is continuing to increase. So I hope you don't cash in your chip anytime soon.
I think I cashed it in a long time ago. This was a story that we didn't go over, but I knew you were going to ask me about how I just sort of built the company, and I was reminded of your, what was it? Your master's program. I forget what you called it.
Yeah, that's right. I had my master's degree.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned that.
Yeah. So, one of the key ingredients for me, at least, kind of midway through, was this, what was it? A brand and marketing plan that you created for us?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That was awesome. It was super helpful. Very well done. I think you got an A on it, which was great.
I certainly did. I'm glad you brought that up. I do have a degree in internet marketing from Full Sail, and part of that was, the main thing was that I had to choose a company to work with for the entirety of the degree, which is a year long. And I chose to work with Scott for all of the reasons that I've already enumerated in this episode. So I'm very glad that really went away to erase some of my karmic debt. But but believe me, in the great scheme of things, I think you're still in the plus column. So on that note, man, I really appreciate it. We're going to have you back if you agree, and keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much for joining me.
And same to you. Keep doing what you're doing, because it's great.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Dan Nessel Show, please head on over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the podcast player of your choice to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And please don't forget to spread the word. Thanks for listening.